Imagine this. It's 1978, Italy. A crime scene that will shock the nation. Aldo Moro, former Italian prime minister and prominent political figure, is found dead in the trunk of an abandoned car in the center of Rome, shot 10 times. The suspects? A group called the Red Brigades, a far-left terrorist organization. The case is quickly solved. The newspapers celebrate. Justice has been served. But one question remains unanswered. How did a simple group of terrorists manage to kidnap and kill one of Italy's most protected men? 30 years later, an Italian investigator unearthed something disturbing in government archives. Classified documents, names of secret agents, and a revelation that would change everything known about that assassination. The Red Brigades? Perhaps they weren't acting alone. There was another organization operating in the shadows, a secret network funded by NATO. Covert operations, assassinations, political destabilization, all officially denied, all hidden for decades. This is the story of Operation Gladio, and it is as real as it is disturbing. Welcome to Files Undercover, the channel where we uncover the world's best-kept secrets. I'm your host, and every week we bring you stories of covert operations, conspiracies, and truths that authorities have tried to bury forever. Today, we're going to explore a secret that has remained hidden for over 40 years. A secret involving dozens of European countries, networks of agents sleeping in ordinary cities, arsenals of weapons hidden in caves and bunkers, and authorization to commit assassinations in peacetime. All orchestrated by an organization you know, NATO. But before we begin, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Because stories like this don't find you by chance. You have to look for them. Let's begin. To understand Operation Gladio, you first need to go back to 1947. World War II had ended just 2 years earlier. Europe was in ruins, and now there was a terrifying new fear hanging over the continent. The fear of the Soviet Union. After World War II, the USSR expanded its dominion over Eastern Europe. The Iron Curtain, as Winston Churchill called it, had descended across the continent. Entire cities were incorporated into the Soviet sphere. Governments were transformed into communist regimes. And there was a worse nightmare haunting Western leaders. What if the Soviets invaded Western Europe? NATO was created in 1949 specifically to defend against this threat. But there was a military problem. If the Soviets invaded, it was unlikely that NATO could defeat them in a conventional war. The USSR had numbers. The USSR had tanks. The USSR had firepower. So NATO strategists thought differently. What if Western Europe was invaded? So NATO would create clandestine resistance networks that would continue fighting even after the Soviet occupation. These networks would be composed of ordinary civilians, farmers, journalists, teachers, normal people who would be secretly trained in sabotage, assassination, and urban guerrilla warfare. They would receive hidden weapons. They would receive instructions on how to make bombs. They would receive false identities. And if the Soviet invasion never happened, well, these networks would remain silent, sleeping in the shadows, waiting for a day that would never come. That was the concept. It seemed innocuous enough. But what actually happened was very, very different. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, intelligence agencies across Europe began establishing these clandestine networks. In Italy, the CIA worked with Italian intelligence to create a network called Gladio, which means sword in Italian. In Belgium, it was called SDRI-8. In France, it was known as NATOs. In Germany, BNV. In Greece, Czech. In each country, there was a different name. But they were all part of the same program. And here's the disturbing part. Nobody knew they existed. National parliaments weren't informed. Prime ministers sometimes weren't informed. Only a small elite of military officers, intelligence agents, and a few trusted politicians knew of the existence of these networks. We're talking about secret operations within democratic governments, funded with taxpayer money, without any democratic oversight. But here's the real problem. These resistance networks were never used against the Soviets. Instead, they were used against their own people. In Italy during the 1970s and 1980s, the CIA station in Rome was concerned about one thing: the growth of the Italian Communist Party. The PCI was the largest communist party in Western Europe. In 1976, it won almost 35% of the vote. The CIA and the Italian political elite believed that if they did nothing, Italy could elect a communist government, not through Soviet invasion, but through democracy. This was unacceptable. So, documents unearthed decades later reveal that members of the Italian Gladio network were used to carry out covert operations against the Italian population. Operations that included bombings, assassinations, and staged terrorist events. In 1980, a bomb exploded at Bologna train station, killing 85 people. Initially, the Red Brigades were blamed, but later investigations suggested it may have been the work of Gladio, operating under a false flag. In fact, there was a pattern that repeated itself across Europe. A series of terrorist attacks would occur. The media would blame far-left groups. These accusations would generate public panic. The panic would justify a tougher security response, and that tougher security response would give conservative governments more power. This is called a false flag operation, when you carry out an operation and blame another group. Gladio apparently became an expert at this. Now we return to the assassination where we began this story. Aldo Moro, 1978. Aldo Moro was a complex politician. He had been Prime Minister of Italy twice. He was intelligent, he was influential, and he was trying to do something that the Western elites didn't want to happen. Moro was trying to create a governing coalition that included the Italian Communist Party. Not a fully communist government, but a coalition that would give communists a voice and power. The CIA believed this was a step in the wrong direction. Documents from the CIA archives declassified years later show that there were discussions about how to prevent this from happening. In March 1978, Moro is kidnapped by a group called the Red Brigades while returning home from the office. His bodyguards are machine-gunned. Moro is taken away. For 55 days, there are attempts at negotiation. The Italian government offers concessions. Moro sends letters asking for negotiation. But the president at the time, Giorgio Leone, and other leaders refuse to negotiate. They say, "We don't negotiate with terrorists." 55 days later, Moro is found dead in the trunk of a car. The Red Brigades claim responsibility. They say they executed Moro because he was an enemy of the people. Case closed. 3 decades of peace. But then, in 2008, investigators unearthed documents. Documents that suggest a very different story. Witnesses stated that Moro had been seen being transported in a white police car. Clues pointed to Italian security agencies. And, most disturbingly, documents revealed that members of the Italian Gladio had direct connections to the kidnapping. Some argue that the Red Brigades were manipulated, or that Gladio was involved, or that Gladio simply let it happen. The full truth? Still obscured. Protected by government secrecy. But one thing is clear, Aldo Moro's death achieved exactly the result the CIA and the Italian elites wanted. He was removed from politics. The experiment of including communists in the coalition was forgotten, and Italy remained firmly under Western control. The pattern wasn't unique to Italy. In Belgium, in 1989, a parliamentary investigation found that the Belgian Gladio network was much larger than imagined. It had hundreds of members. It had access to arsenals of weapons. And there were records of covert operations that were not reported to elected parliamentarians. In Greece, the Greek Gladio network was used to establish a 7-year military dictatorship from 1967 to 1974. Unearthed documents show that CIA members worked with members of the Greek network to help facilitate the military coup. In Turkey, the equivalent network was accused of political assassinations and disappearances during the 1970s and 1980s. Hundreds of people were killed in seemingly terrorist operations by far-left groups. But investigations suggest that these terrorist groups sometimes included members of the clandestine network, operating under false flags. In France, there were scandals involving members of the French network, planting explosives in the cars of journalists who were writing about sensitive operations. In Germany, the network was accused of conspiracy in the disappearance of a young woman who had witnessed suspicious activities. Across Europe, the pattern was the same. A network of agents funded by the CIA trained to defeat the Soviet invasion, but in reality used to assassinate inconvenient politicians, defeat leftist movements, stabilize pro-Western governments, and keep the population under control through fear, all while remaining completely secret. Operation Gladio wasn't revealed to the world until 1990, more than 40 years after it began. And how was it revealed? By chance. An Italian judge named Felice Casson was investigating the 1980 Bologna bombing. He had followed clues that led him to classified documents mentioning Gladio. He started digging, and the deeper he dug, the more disturbing it became. Casson discovered records of missing weapons, names of agents who were also involved in terrorist attacks, communications between intelligence agencies discussing covert operations, and documents suggesting that terrorist attacks were, in fact, carried out by members of the network. Casson presented his findings to the Italian parliament in 1990. There was a scandal. Newspaper headlines, court summons. And then it was all silenced. A deal was struck. Documents were sealed for national security reasons. Investigations were closed. No one was criminally prosecuted. No one was arrested. The Italian government simply said, yes, Gladio existed. It wasn't meant to be used like that. Sorry, we're closing now, and that's it. Closed, filed away, forgotten. When the Belgian parliament investigated the Belgian Gladio network in 1990, it discovered that the network had 11,000 tons of weapons hidden in bunkers. 11,000 tons, explosives, rifles, machine guns, all secretly hidden in a democratic country without the knowledge of the people. When the Belgian government was asked how was this legal, the answer was, well, technically it wasn't approved by law, it just happened. Nobody was held accountable. So here's the disturbing question. If Operation Gladio was revealed over 30 years ago, why have most people never heard of it? The answer is simple. It was buried. Mainstream media outlets barely covered the story. History books don't mention it. Documentaries are rare. Why? Because Gladio implicated not only the CIA but also elected European governments. It suggested that terrorist operations that killed hundreds or perhaps thousands of civilians were carried out or allowed by the very institutions that were supposed to protect those civilians. It suggested that Western democracy wasn't as pure as we're told. It suggested that governments were willing to lie, kill, and conspire to maintain power. And what if the European population actually understood the full truth about Gladio? Well, there could be political consequences. So the story was minimized, reduced to a mere obscure chapter of the Cold War. Something that happened but is now resolved. Documents were sealed, investigations were closed, histories were rewritten, and the world moved on. But the documents don't lie. And there are investigators, journalists, and historians who continue to unearth the truth. The truth about how NATO used a secret network of sleeping agents to destabilize nations, assassinate politicians, and wage war against their own people. All in the name of Western security. Operation Gladio shows us something important. Real power is rarely exercised openly. It is exercised in the shadows. Through secret networks, covert operations, coordinated lies. History books talk about democracy. They talk about human rights. They talk about free elections. But the truth is more complex and darker. Because while you vote, while you believe you are making free choices, there are networks operating behind the scenes. Making decisions you never voted for. Carrying out operations you never approved, all in your name. Operation Gladio was exposed, but the same structures that allowed it remain. Now let me ask you a question. If Gladio was only revealed in 1990, when would the standard then be? What other covert operations are happening right now that we don't know about? What networks are operating in our countries without democratic oversight? These are questions that must be asked. So, if you believe that history should not be forgotten, subscribe to the Files Undercover channel. Turn on notifications so you don't miss our upcoming episodes about undercover operations, government conspiracy, and secrets that authorities prefer to keep hidden. Also, like this video. Every like helps us reach more people with the truth. Because the truth matters, and it deserves to be heard. I'm your host on Files Undercover. See you in the next episode.